right, 5 minutes after 9 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I late in life became interested in history, and lately I've been looking at history of New York City because I grew up there. And in Lower Manhattan, there's the original St. Patrick's Cathedral. I guess you can only have one. So this is now St. Patrick's Basilica. And it's interesting how Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants, they didn't always get along, Yeah. It is interesting to see how things that we kind of know today, and we don't always know the roots of everything. And when we saw the movie Gotti, it sort of gave us a sort of a sense of what it was like, the last, I guess, 50 years or so for that world, right?
Yeah.
I guess, or so. Andrew Gross has written a book called Button Man, and what I love about it is that it teaches me some of those things that I've been wanting to know about, but it does it by telling a story, which for some reason, I guess it just says something about my inability to really pay attention to history unless there's somehow a story attached to it. And this is a good one. The book actually doesn't even come out till tomorrow, but Andrew Gross does his job well. I mean, he writes well, and he's a great... He's teaching history. It's an historical thriller. Button Man is a Jewish family at the dawn of the women's garment business in New York, torn apart by the birth of organized crime. Let's just find out about the book. Good morning, Andrew. Thank you for being on the show with us today.
Hi, Larry. How are you doing?
Good.
Both of you. How's it going?
Well, good. Where are you?
Outside of New York, at least for the next few hours, and then I'm on the road for 10 days.
Have you always had an interest in the history of that city or history in general?
Well, it's actually a little more personal for me. This is another side of the story that you were just telling, maybe about Italian and Irish immigrants. This is the story of growing up Jewish on the Lower East Side, and it's the story of someone who was the only one in his family born here who had to go to leave school by the time he was 12 to help support his family by apprenticing in a garment factory, ended up running that factory by the time he was 20, started a company with his brother. They ended up fighting the Jewish mob, who was preying on their own kind because they had taken over for their own gain all of the garment unions, and then ultimately turned his company into a national brand. And that person was my grandfather. So to me, I'm telling my family story.
Oh, wow!
And which is obviously with a few embellishments for the sake of suspense. Of course, it's what I do. I write suspense novels, but this is really this is my family story. And as a matter of fact, tonight I'm at Barnes & Noble on the west side of Manhattan, and there'll be about 50 people in my family there. And it's sort of a different way to approach writing because it goes back almost to the original form of telling an oral story based on truth, of course, about your own family. So
I love
what could be more personal? Yeah.
So what year does this story begin to take place in?
It starts in 1905, where there's a family tragedy. That the story of three brothers, and one of the brothers, you're going to hear some barking in a minute.
I heard that.
Yeah. My housekeeper is coming in and downstairs, and the dogs will react accordingly. So let me close the door.
I love
a little, just some reality intruding. But it takes place starts in 1905 and goes up to 1935. So it's really a very graphic picture of the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was, an area teeming with both, people and crime. It was very hard to get out of there. There were really two ways out for anybody on the Lower East Side, at least if you were Jewish. One of them was the garment business because there were no barriers to entry at all for people with no money, and the other was crime. And what people really don't know about that era is that before the Italian mafia sort of gained this whole cultural resonance that it has now, the Jewish mob was in control of New York, and it was far more bloody than the Italians were. As a matter of fact, the Italians would farm out their hits to the Jews for business.
Hence the
name Murder Incorporated, which I don't know if it's famous to you, but it's certainly famous in our world. Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz and Louis Lepke were the creators of Murder Incorporated, which was the first they were the first hitmen.
So if I could go to the Italian mafia just for a second to ask a question about the Jewish mob, I guess instead of calling it mafia, we'll call it mob, right?
Right.
I'm not a great historian, but what I understood was that the Irish immigrants were all running for office and were getting elected, and they were making rules from a quote unquote official capacity, and it was
right. They were in control of Tammany Hall, yes,
and it was interfering with the desires of the Italian immigrants who were trying to establish businesses, and so they had to create their own sort of government or enforcement, and that was the birth of the mafia. Is there anything similar with the Jewish mob or the Jewish?
No, I think the Jewish mob, to the degree that I'm an historian over it, I'm a novelist, but it developed from the streets. And there was prostitution, there was gambling almost on every street. Women who, and I'm talking young women, who didn't want to find themselves behind a needle, a sewing machine, became prostitutes in alleys. Any corner had gambling scams that were trying to fleece people who were just off the boat. So I think this is sort of where it originated more,
Yeah. It's a fascinating time. I mean, the city has changed so much since those days. I mean, even since when I was a kid in the 70s, I mean, the city seems so much cleaner or something now. It's just hard to imagine all that. I don't know.
Oh, it is. And gentrified. I don't know. You grew up in New York?
Yeah. And gentrified is a good word. And sometimes people don't like that, but it seems, I don't know, it seems safer or whatever now. Just does.
Oh, it's totally. I mean, I grew up in Manhattan, and I grew up on the west side of Manhattan, and we wouldn't even walk 2 blocks from our home, and we lived in I don't want to say the wrong thing, but we lived in a pretty posh place, and literally 2 blocks away were some of the worst streets in New York. Mm-hmm. So today, those streets, the townhouses go for $4 or $5 million and up on those streets. So it's totally changed. Yeah.
Usually in period pieces, people like to romanticize crime and events and things like that. Well, you did a great job on this period piece where it shows the crux of everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks. I have a writer friend named Lorenzo Carcaterra who and he writes about the mafia a lot in his books, and he paid me a good compliment by saying that he's never read a book where the fiction and the truth of crime sort of melded so seamlessly, and I appreciated that. I even have to, as you know, there are even some Italians in this book because they were in cahoots with the Jews at that time. So Albert Anastasia is a character in this book as well. And it does have, it's of course, it's fiction, and it's propelled by fictional characters. These 3 brothers, one of whom is scarred by a family tragedy and is seduced into crime. So you have, 2 brothers who are trying to make a go of it in life, and the other one who has sort of given himself over to crime. But there are a lot of real life figures in this book, and Louis Lepke was one of the few people ever electrocuted at Sing Sing for murder, although I've just given away the ending, or not the ending, but the postscript, the afterward, but and Dutch Schultz is famous, and then the prosecutor, Thomas Dewey, who ended up being governor of New York and actually ran for vice presidency. He was sort of the steadfast moral compass who was the Eliot Ness of his time, and was going after these guys, and single-mindedly. So it's littered. I don't know if anyone remembers the book Ragtime, but it has a lot of sort of ragtime in it, where there's a lot of real characters floating around with fictional characters.
I like the fact that you bring out that a lot of these people didn't go far in school, like not past the 6th grade, but they were successful on the good end.
Well, I have a lot of admiration for these people. Before I started writing, I grew up in the garment trade. My family had a pretty large company, and before I sort of, figured out what it was I wanted to do in life, I worked with them, and it was it was on the New York Stock Exchange, so it wasn't tiny, and I knew a lot of these figures who grew up from the streets and ended up, building, they were old timers to me then, but building the kind of companies, and I'm not sure if you would know these names, but from the 40s to the 80s, they were Jonathan Logan, Bobby Brooks, R&K, Russ Toggs, Leslie Fay. These were the biggest companies in the country before things like Liz Claiborne came on the scene. These were monster brands and they were all run by these tough, gruff, street honed people who could make you pee in your pants if they yelled at you, and they were called killers. I mean, that was our expression in the industry, like, oh God, Abe Schwartz, he's a killer, and it was both affectionate and feared at the same time. And my grandfather was one of those characters. And so, a lot of them didn't make it. Nobody went to college. That was a dream, but a lot of them didn't even get past the sixth grade, and they were out there and made something big of their lives from nothing. So to me, I have like crazy admiration for these people. And these are first generational stories that a lot of families have, whether they're Italian or Irish or, Jewish, or whether their family was in the garment trade, or whether they were teachers or doctors, or, this is like what's poignant about America. And to me, even with an immigrant culture, which I'm someone who feels that built our country as we know it. So.
The justification for crime syndicates in general is often that they existed as protective agencies, I guess you could say. That's kind of one of the messages of that movie Gotti that came out last year, or earlier this year. Is that the same thing true in the Jewish community? Were they serving as guards, as protectors?
Well, the flip side of what you say is the word extortion, and that's what these mobs were. They were extorters.
Sure, absolutely.
And the people they were extorting, or quote unquote protecting from themselves, were the Jewish entrepreneurs who were in the garment trade.
Oh my gosh.
So
wow.
in this particular thing, they had taken over the union. They were literally, if people didn't cooperate, they'd throw you out of the 14th floor of the building, literally. And there is that in the book. They would throw acid on you. They would come in and destroy all your inventory. So these were the sort of tactics they were using, and they were very rough. Now, under the guise of quote unquote protection, but what they wanted was money. And if you paid them money, you were safe. So it's the classic. Protection is really a nicer way to call extortion.
So is this going to be the advent of a new era in entertainment based on the mob or the mafia? But in this case, it's going to be the Jewish mafia. We haven't seen a whole lot of that, actually.
No, you haven't, and that's why I'm sort of pleased to tell the story. And I'm not turning it into. I don't know if this is going to be the new Godfather, but what I do think is that, look, the word button man, which I'm sure you probably think refers to the garment side of the thing, was actually what they called hitmen in the Jewish mob. Button
wow, I didn't know that.
So that's where that term comes in. So I very few people know much about this era, except, some of us who were Jewish and paid attention to that kind of thing. But I think it's sort of eye-opening to most people, because no one really had a sense of what the Jewish mob was about, because Jews are traditionally looked at, especially through the lens of World War II, of people who didn't fight back, who in some way were overwhelmed and were, I don't know if the right word is passive, but, had no choices in terms of this. But the people who grew up on the Lower East Side were tough as nails. And as one mother says in the book, don't let those yarmulkes fool you. They'll kill you just the same,
It is interesting how New York is so ethnically divided, but yet nobody seems to have an issue with that. But it's always been the way that, maybe not so much now, but I mean, we have different neighborhoods with different ethnicities as labels.
Not so much anymore, I think.
Yeah, I don't think so much anymore. My dad was a policeman in the city, and in fact, he worked in headquarters. I don't know if you know, on Center Street, that's now a condominium. So that's not too far from where you're talking about.
No, it isn't down there. And, something interesting to do there the next time you're in town, and it's incredibly interesting, is what's called a tenement museum in New York. And it's mostly a Jewish thing, but it's a series of buildings that they've taken over and shown how life was on the Lower East Side.
I've heard of this. And yes,
it's great. I mean, anyone who goes of any background just sees the way New York was, around the turn of the century. And look, there were 20 million immigrants that came to this country between 1880 and 1910. Wow. They weren't all Jewish, let's be honest. Obviously.
Right. Yeah.
So even though this book has that, has that storyline to it, it's everyone. So I have no interest in the tenement museum, but I think any of your guests make it up there.
Right.
In addition to going to the Met and the Guggenheim, this is really something to do that's culturally fascinating.
That is cool. I heard there was an unfinished bagel, a partially eaten bagel.
You bring up the book Great Expectations in your book, Button Man.
Right. Well, I sort of refer to the book as the marriage of Dickens's Great Expectations meets The Godfather, and Great Expectations because it is a boy to manhood story of someone who grows up poor and without roots, really, who grows in, and it is there's in the background of a class struggle, and it is sort of his life, and at some point, especially when he's battling crime and standing up to the mob, it becomes pretty tense and exciting. And The Godfather, for the obvious reasons that it sort of not only deals with organized crime, but in this sort of uniquely cultural way where The Godfather did it for Italians and this one does it more for the Jews.
But you do have a love story in there between Morris.
Well, yeah, you have to, of course, it's a romance, I suppose. Yeah, of course, because in a thriller, what is more poignant to protect or to put in harm and then protect is your own family, of course. So you need that, I suppose.
I'm curious, how aware are you, or have you been all of your life, on the influence of those early days? The things that happened in 1905 must have affected you in some way. Were you aware of that, or did it become something you became more aware of as you got older?
A little of both. I think if you're the kind of person that looks at your family generationally, I was totally aware of what the background. My grandfather was our patriarch. I mean, to give you an example, the FIT, the Fashion Institute of Technology, which is this, in New York, I think there's like 12 buildings. It's a big school dedicated to, all sides of the retail and garment business. And the biggest building on this campus is named the Fred P. Pomerantz Hall, so it's named after him.
Wow.
So he was kind of a pivotal figure in this industry. And what's interesting about my grandfather is that to the day he died, he would literally pull up his shirt and show you the knife scars that he bore in his abdomen, courtesy of Jacob Garra, who was Louis Lepke's henchman, who was the head of Murder Incorporated. So he was stabbed multiple times. They tried to kill him to get him to sort of back off and comply with what they wanted, and he was brazenly he stood up to them. So in our family, he's kind of a rich person, was always a very rich and personality, and so a lot of these stories were stories that I grew up with that are in the book, and I think anyone who reads it will really get a strong sense of sort of this Jewish lore and a lot of larger than life stories, a lot of really kind of interesting stories.
Well, when you were growing up and you heard these stories and you met other people that heard, other children your age that heard these stories, were you ridiculed sometimes, or did you have an okay growing up where?
Yeah, well, I didn't grow up on the Lower East side. So no, I grew up in a school that was mostly upper middle class Jews. So no one was ridiculing us at this point. I did get mugged a few times on the streets of New York, but that was common back then. No, there was no ridicule about it. As my grandfather's company grew into a large diversified company on the New York Stock Exchange. So if anything, it was pretty respected.
So were the Jewish businessmen who were legit, obviously separated. It's almost cannibalistic in the way.
Yeah.
So were they? Did they have names for each other? I mean, did the good guys have names for the bad guys? I guess that's the easiest way to ask.
Just thugs, tough, toughs. Maybe some things I can't say on the radio, I suppose. The first scene or the second scene of the book, so I'm not giving too much away, is when my hero, whose name is Morris Rob, they shorten his name to Rob from Rubashevsky when he's 12, goes back to his building and realizes that someone in his building, where he works, where he has his company, and his good friend, that the mob's paid a visit to him, and he rushes up there, and his mentor and friend has been doused in the face with acid because he was trying to circumvent. Not only would the mob insist that you pay extortion money, but they basically also set up this whole chain of supply that if you didn't buy through them, you were violating, and you'd get punished. And so the second scene of the book is someone who's been punished pretty severely, and his entire inventory ripped apart, shredded. He was a furrier. His face doused with acid, so he would never look right again. Even from the beginning, you get this sense of how the businessmen sort of, what they were facing, because they were preying. It was Jew against Jew at that point, but it really wasn't Jew against Jew as much as it was, criminal against legitimate businessmen.
That's it. Wow. I love the title that you settled on, by the way. Button Man. It's just a great title. I have a copy of Button Man here. It doesn't come out until tomorrow, so you're getting it a day before it actually is released. It's already doing really well on Amazon, believe it or not. I don't know if you keep up with that stuff, but it's the day before it's released, it's at number 120. Hello.
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
Marvelous.
Well, that's always good. I'm glad you point that out, because we always pretend that we don't look, but I'm sure as soon as we close out this interview, we're all peaking, at least,
Andy, give me a second. I want to give the book away. Good morning. You've got the book. Who's this?
Sonny,
you got the book. It'll be waiting for you here at the station.
All right. Yeah, I part of my childhood was in Knickerbocker Village. Have a good day, everybody.
All right, Knickerbocker.
Thanks.
Where is that area? I don't know that area. Where is that?
I don't even know where Knickerbocker Village is. I'm just thinking it sort of sounds like the Yorkville area, the Upper East Side, but I can't swear that I know it. We'll have to Google it. I don't. Yeah.
Me too. All right. Gosh, I've loved talking to you. Thank you so much for being on the air with us today.
Let's see.
Pleasure. I mentioned Amazon. Do you want to mention any websites?
Well, excuse me, AndrewGrossBooks.com. You can, Facebook. I mean, we're all, the interesting thing about writers today is that for generations you would have to send something into the publisher and see if 6 months later you got a reply. Today you can get us immediately and, digitally. So we're all willing to engage. So very
good. Thank you for being on there with us. I loved the conversation.
Pleasure.
Good luck with the book.
All right. Thanks a lot. All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
You're welcome. We'll be right back.
AccuSleep offers a safe and effective medical option for those who suffer from sleep disorders of all kinds. AccuSleep makes restoring healthy sleep patterns possible. No medication, no surgery, just good, sound sleep. Mend your sleep so you can stop counting sheep. Experience restorative sleep at AccuSleep, the acupuncture sleep clinic in Ocala, by calling 352-615-5566.
The College of Central Florida is committed to being your first choice for quality higher education. CF has locations in Marion, Citrus, and Levy counties and offers more than 60 academic programs. Earn a certificate, associate, or bachelor's degree. With Florida's 2+2 program, a student can complete an associate in arts at CF and be guaranteed admission to a state of Florida university. CF is ranked number 13 in the U.S. for affordability, is military friendly, and offers a full student life experience. Make CF your first choice. Call 352-873-5800.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Chris Foster. A woman accusing Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault when they were in high school deserves to be heard, says White House counsel Kellyanne Conway.
This woman will be heard. She's going to, I think the Senate Judiciary Committee will decide how and through which forum. In other words, will it be by telephone? Will it be in person?
She was on Fox and Friends. Judge Kavanaugh denies the accusation. Rescue teams are looking for a baby swept away from a flooded